Okay, so in the last video we examined the popular idea that the distinction between nature and nurture is essentially the distinction between genes and environment. Innate traits are those that are encoded in the genes. And we saw that this faces some pretty serious problems, but I think there's an understandable intuition behind the genetic encoding criterion. We think of innate traits as those that are in some sense built into us from birth. Right, even if they may not be expressed at birth, there's some sense in which they're kind of ready to be expressed. There's like a disposition for them to be expressed from birth. So rather than talk about genetic encoding, some people have tried to define innateness in terms of adaptation. Innate traits are those traits that are adaptations, where an adaptation is a trait that has evolved and is maintained through the process of natural selection. The human eye, for example, is a very complex and sophisticated organ, built and refined by selection over millions of years. People in the past whose eyes had problems with their lenses, say, so that their vision was blurry, well, those people would have been less likely to survive and reproduce. On the other hand, being a fan of Frank Zappa, that's acquired, because this disposition has not been produced by selection. It's not the case that a bunch of people in the past were dying off because they didn't enjoy Frank Zappa. So I think that this kind of view fits pretty well with the standard talk of innateness. And I think it's worth noting that when we see claims about innate differences between humans, this often seems to be explained in terms of adaptation. So take the idea that men are innately more inclined to promiscuous sexual behaviour than women. This is a claim that is sometimes made by evolutionary psychologists, and they explain this in terms of how pregnancy imposes a very high cost on women. So if a woman reproduces, this is necessarily going to take a lot of time and effort and physical risk, whereas a man can reproduce just by having sex and then leaving, right? There's not necessarily any further cost. All the man needs to do is get the sperm in there. Whereas for the women, there will be very significant costs necessarily. There's just no way of avoiding that. So this fundamental biological difference meant that women were selected to be more choosy and more cautious than men. Women have to be very careful who they choose to have sex with. Men and women are then innately endowed with different behavioural strategies with respect to sex. Right, so that's a common sort of argument that you might see. I have a video on evolutionary psychology if you're interested in more detail about these kinds of arguments. I think that this kind of view does seem to at least be fairly intuitive. So how do we determine whether or not a particular trait is an adaptation? I mean, this is particularly a difficult question when we think about psychological and behavioural traits. Well, the primary method that's been used by ethologists at least is the isolation experiment, which is popularised by Konrad Lorenz. Lorenz studied animal behaviour from a kind of Darwinian perspective, and he believed that he could identify particular units of behaviour that had been produced by natural selection. He called them fixed action patterns. And the isolation experiment method was used to identify these traits. So essentially this method just involves raising animals in isolation from the environmental stimuli related to the trait being studied. For example, if you raise rats in isolation from any contact with other rats, so basically you just raise a rat on its own, it never has any social interaction with other rats, well, when the isolated rat becomes pregnant, it will try to use material in its surroundings to build nests. Now, since there's no possible way that nest building behaviour could have been learned, because the rat didn't observe any other animals building nests, well, this behaviour must be innate. It must be an adaptation. In general then, when an animal does not receive the normal environmental cues, any behavioural traits it develops must be innate. A similar kind of argument, but particularly with respect to human cognition, has been developed by Noam Chomsky, and it's known as the poverty of the stimulus argument. Chomsky works in linguistics, and he was interested in the question of how do children acquire knowledge of grammatical rules, right? The rules which tell us how to put words together to form meaningful sentences. These rules are extremely complex, right? I mean, now obviously to adults, you know, the language is second nature, right? But you know, just try learning a new language. It's incredibly hard, right? Nevertheless, all languages are very well ordered. They are comprehensively structured by very strict rules of grammar that tell you how to make meaningful statements. So how do children acquire these rules? Well, one obvious answer is they learn the rules, just as they might learn any other complex practice. It's a combination of copying adults, right, because children are exposed to the speech of adults, so they can copy what they hear. There will be some explicit instruction, because adults will sometimes sit down with children and teach them how the language works. And there'll be a bit of trial and error. A child will say something novel and new, and if the adults don't respond properly, maybe the adults tell them, no, that's wrong. Well, this will show the child that they were applying the wrong rule. So that's one kind of view, but according to Chomsky, children just aren't exposed to enough evidence to do this. The data that they receive from adults is not sufficient to allow them to learn the rules of the language. And so Chomsky concludes there must be some innate understanding of grammar. There must be what he calls a kind of innate language acquisition device, which guides the development of a child's linguistic knowledge. So this is the poverty of the stimulus argument. Yeah, the stimulus, the environmental stimulus, is impoverished relative to the trait that the child eventually develops, the trait being language. Basically then we can think of every childhood as being a kind of isolation experiment which demonstrates the innateness of, well, some sort of grammatical knowledge. Okay, so just as a sort of specific example here, this is given in the Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy article on innateness and language. Consider these sentences. So, Jacob is happy today. Is Jacob happy today? The girls are dancing. Are the girls dancing? And let's say that the child wants to understand the rule by which you turn a declarative sentence, such as Jacob is happy today, into a question, such as is Jacob happy today? Okay, so the child sort of wants to know how you transform declarative sentences into questions. And I mean, obviously, given these sentences, there are many rules you might apply, but just two possible rules are, so G1 is find the first occurrence of is or are in the sentence and move it to the front. And G2, find the first occurrence of is or are following the subject-noun phrase of the sentence and move it to the front. So if you apply G1 and G2 to to sentences 1 and 3 that we just saw, then in both cases you're going to get sentences 2 and 4. So these rules are both compatible with the sentences we saw. So which rule is right? Which rule do we actually use? Well, notice that G1 is clearly the simpler hypothesis, right? And it doesn't involve any kind of reference to theoretical constructs such as, you know, subject-noun phrase, right? Subject-noun phrase is a kind of very, I guess, abstract theoretical construct. So it's a lot simpler. It's a lot more kind of obvious and easy to understand. But if we were to apply this rule, we'd obviously get the wrong answers. We'd get sentences like this. You know, the girl who is in the castle is Kayleigh's daughter would be transformed into is the girl who in the castle is Kayleigh's daughter, which is nonsense. So every English speaker knows, at least implicitly, that G2 is the correct rule. G2 is the rule that we actually apply. G2 would give us, you know, is the girl who is in the castle Kayleigh's daughter? And we know this, you know, before puberty. We know this when we're still kids. But Chomsky suggests it's very unlikely that we could have discovered this kind of rule just through experience. Firstly, parents don't correct children's grammar often enough, right? In general, it's rare that children are explicitly told that their grammar is wrong. When a child says something with the wrong grammar, you generally just ignore it. So I think that what tends to happen is parents will correct factual mistakes. You know, when a child says something that's factually wrong, they tend to be corrected. But when children say ungrammatical sentences, it tends to be ignored. Furthermore, children aren't exposed to a wide enough range of different sentences when hearing adults speak. And many of the sentences that children are exposed to will be incomplete or ungrammatical, just because people often stumble in their spoken speech. And I think actually another point that might be worth noting here is that children, I'm pretty sure children don't make mistakes, like 6 in the first place, right? Even though the rule that generates this sentence number 6, is a very intuitive, it's a very simple and intuitive rule if you're thinking about it from a kind of unbiased perspective, right? The rule that generates 6 is very simple, very straightforward, and yet it seems that children don't bother even trying out this rule. It seems like they have some sort of cognitive mechanism which constrains the linguistic rules that they will consider. So this mechanism sort of sets them in the right direction. And I guess this all points to another reason to think that there might be an adaptation for language acquisition. It's that all children follow a similar developmental pattern with respect to language. All 3-year-olds tend to speak with the same complexity, and in particular they tend to make the same mistakes. Similarly for all 5-year-olds and so on. By the age of 8 or so, language development is nearly complete, at least with respect to the grammatical rules. That isn't what we'd expect if language was entirely learned. You'd think that kids would make very different mistakes as they try very different rules out. So you'd see children speaking very completely differently at different ages. So so all of this sort of builds up a picture where we can see language is involving some sort of innate mechanism. Just as the eye is an adaptation, it's something crafted gradually over millions of years by natural selection, Chomsky suggests that selection has produced this language acquisition device in the brain, and this endows us with an implicit understanding of certain, I guess, rules and constraints on language use. It gives us maybe a set of procedures for understanding and generating language. This set of innate procedures provided by the language acquisition device is sometimes called the universal grammar. It's universal because every normal human has it. So with this innate universal grammar plus exposure to a specific language in the environment, that's what allows you to acquire a specific language like English. So much linguistic knowledge is unlearned and hence innate. Now, Chomsky's argument is, I think, quite widely accepted in linguistics, but I should note that it has come under quite a lot of criticism more recently. So if you're interested in this topic, I would, you should look it up. There's a lot that's been written about this, and a lot of people now have kind of questioned the premises of Chomsky's argument. A lot of people have argued that actually children are exposed to enough data. So I'm not saying that this is at all fixed. Chomsky might be wrong about this, but the point for us is the general form of this argument provides us with a model for understanding innateness. Innate traits are adaptations, and here we have a particular way of discovering whether or not some behavioural or psychological trait is an adaptation. Okay, let's think about some problems for the adaptation account. First of all, this method of kind of isolation, the isolation method, has been quite strongly criticised. One of the major problems with this method is, how do we know that the animals being studied have in fact been isolated from the relevant environmental cues? How do we know what the relevant environmental cues actually are? So Daniel Lerman pointed out that the rats in Lorenz's experiments may well have learned the skills involved in nest building from the experience of moving droppings out of the way and carrying food pellets, which is something they will do in their cages. So he set up an experiment with powdered food and mesh floors. So basically the rats were unable to carry the food because it's powder, and their droppings just fell through the mesh floors. So they could no longer kind of pick stuff up and carry it around and so on. Now in this situation, rats no longer attempted to build nests. So perhaps their nest building is something that the rat learns. It figures it out through interactions with its environment. So all we can conclude from the isolation experiments is that the development of a trait does not depend on the specific factors that were removed in the development. But this is not to say that the trait is innate, because, well, maybe you just haven't considered all of the relevant environmental factors. So I suppose, one general point that's worth making in response to this is, obviously the defender of the adaptation account will accept that there may be degrees of innateness. Consider, say, 3 different cases of the development of bird song. Right? In the first case, the bird develops its species song without hearing anything from other members of the species. In the second case, the bird develops its song after hearing only part of the song of its species. And in the third case, the bird develops its song only when it's exposed to the full song. Right? It needs to hear the whole song before it picks it up. Now, in the third case, it seems like the development of the song is learned, not innate. At least the form of the song is learned, not innate. In the first 2 cases, the environmental input is impoverished relative to the capacity that develops, but some elements are required still in the second case. In the second case, there are certain environmental triggers that are required. And that's how, obviously, language development in children works on Chomsky's view. Obviously, the child needs some exposure to language. So you need some input of the data there. So we can say that different traits have different degrees of innateness, and the degree of innateness depends on the impoverishment of the environmental input. So the rat case, Lorenz's rat case, then demonstrates innateness to a certain degree. It seems like there must be some adaptation for nest building, because even if the rat can work out how to build a nest on the basis of its experience with moving droppings and food pellets, well, how would it know that it would need a nest in the first place? It seems kind of unreasonable to attribute this degree of knowledge to rats. Now, of course, animal intelligence is a controversial area, but presumably rats don't engage in sophisticated reasoning about the future, like I'm pregnant, therefore I'm going to have a kid. The kid will need shelter, therefore I need to build a nest. Now, that probably isn't occurring. So it seems like there's probably some innate adaptation towards nest building, and then that's going to require certain environmental triggers. I don't really think that's inconsistent with the adaptation account. Okay, a key idea in defense of the isolation method is that there are cases where we can relate the information available in the environment to the information involved in expressing the trait. So where this is information in the kind of richer semantic sense discussed in the previous video. And this view is defended by Muhammad Ali Khalidi. Again, consider bird song. Suppose that birds could develop their song in the absence of any social interaction. So they don't need to hear any part of the song from other birds. Well, if we find this out, then we might conclude that the song is innate. But now suppose that actually the development of the song requires interaction with twigs. Right? Birds that play with twigs develop their song. Birds that are isolated from twigs have no song. This would be an unexpected environmental trigger, but it's certainly possible. So Khalidi says that we should, even in this case, still judge that the song is innate, because although the twigs are required to trigger the song, the twigs don't contribute any informational content. You can't get, say, the melody of the song from playing with a twig. This is the sort of same idea really behind Chomsky's work on language development. Given the linguistic data to children, you can't learn the language rules. The data is informationally impoverished relative to the capacity that the child develops. So it's this. It's informational impoverishment basically is the key idea. And I suppose that with the rats, well, yes, a rat may be able to learn, say, how to build a nest from moving pellets of food around, but moving pellets of food around sort of doesn't contain the plan of a nest, right? It doesn't contain the information. It's informationally impoverished relative to the information that is contained in a nest building. So, I mean, this is, I think, quite an interesting idea, maybe kind of vague. I mean, it's hard to define, I suppose, the information contained in the environment and the information contained in a trait. But maybe a more serious problem, as Griffiths, in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on innate and acquired traits, points out, it runs into some pretty serious difficulties when we think about traits that are considered deficits, so traits that are failures in development, essentially. Consider Down syndrome. Down syndrome, among other things, often involves cognitive disabilities. Now, on Khaledi's view, innate traits are those traits for which the environment does not contribute enough information for the trait to be learned. Right? There's a gap between the information in the environment and the information manifested in the trait. But in what sense is the environmental input informationally impoverished with respect to the cognitive deficits associated with Down syndrome? I mean, obviously, like if we were to do an isolation experiment here, if we were to raise a child in isolation from the normal educational cues, well, they'd still develop Down syndrome, right? They'd still have the cognitive disabilities. So it would still be there in an isolation experiment, and you might say, well, that shows it's innate. But the point is, the isolation experiment just seems inappropriate in this case, because it's like, well, Down syndrome involves a cognitive deficit, so obviously it's still going to be there if you remove the normal environmental cues. This whole kind of approach, thinking of things in terms of informational impoverishment and isolation experiments and so on, just doesn't seem the right way to think about traits like Down syndrome. So that's maybe a bigger problem. So one of the most serious problems for the adaptation account, I guess, kind of is connected with this last point, is posed by traits that are detrimental to the organism. So consider, visual illusions. I'm sure you've seen plenty of visual illusions. Presumably most of these are innate. I mean, if we think that perceptual capacities are innate, then I would assume that visual illusions would be too. But visual illusions don't seem to be adaptive. A more serious example would be something like sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a byproduct of an adaptation for malaria resistance, because the gene that confers malaria resistance also causes sickle cell anemia when in the homozygous condition. Or Huntington's disease, that's a very serious disease caused by a specific genetic mutation where I think it's part of a particular sequence of DNA is lengthened, basically. So, I mean, I suppose in some of these cases you could say that innate traits are any traits that are adaptations plus traits that are byproducts of adaptations. Sickle cell anemia counts as innate because it's a byproduct of an adaptation for malaria resistance. I mean, maybe that would work, but obviously that kind of response isn't going to cover something like Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is not a byproduct of something that has any benefits. The mutation that causes it is wholly negative. As I say, it's just a sequence of DNA basically gets lengthened. There's a mutation that produces that lengthening, and it doesn't seem to do any good to have that. It just causes this terrible disease. So it's, I mean, presumably Huntington's disease is innate, right? But it surely isn't an adaptation. A more general problem for the adaptationist account is that arguably many innate traits that are not harmful are also not to be explained as adaptations either. So, an adaptation is a trait that has been produced and is maintained by natural selection. In the last video, though, we discussed the example of blue eyes. Blue eyes are produced by an absence of melanin pigment. Now, the production of melanin is an adaptation for protection from sunlight, but as I mentioned last time, when humans moved into the northern hemisphere, where it's less sunny, there was less selection pressure to keep up the melanin production. Mutations could then accumulate just by chance, leading to the spread of blue eyes. And I think the same story is the case with skin colour. There's no selection for white skin, rather there's selection for dark skin in areas with heavy exposure to sunlight, and then when humans moved into different areas, that selection was relaxed and mutations accumulated. So these don't seem to be adaptations, but surely blue eyes and white skin are innate. A further point that's been raised by some biologists, like Stephen Jay Gould most famously, is that many traits should not be treated as adaptations, but rather as structural constraints or developmental constraints that are imposed by essentially particular features of development. And perhaps the best case of this is the general body plan of the organism. So, for example, all insects have three basic body regions: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. It's very unlikely that this general structure is optimal for all insects. It may have been an adaptation originally, but now it's kind of a frozen accident, and it's maintained simply because it's set down so early in development of the embryo. Adult organisms are a product of a long series of developmental stages, which begins with the embryo. Now, the early embryonic stages are very resistant to change, because any changes in early development would cause cascading and unpredictable changes through the rest of development, which in almost all cases is going to be very seriously negative for the organism. So evolutionary changes tend to occur to the later stages of development. But changing the basic body plan, that would require variation in the early stages of development, because the basic body plan is set down in those early stages. So what we generally find is that these basic body plans are essentially fixed. So the body plan should no longer be seen as an adaptation, but surely it's innate. I'd recommend checking out my video on adaptationism for further discussion of cases like this. I've got a couple of videos on adaptationism, and it's I think a really interesting problem. But the point for us now is that it seems there are many traits which just aren't adaptations. Now, I suppose that one thing you might say about this is, well, adaptation is not necessary for innateness, but maybe it is sufficient. But there are perhaps other ways that a trait could be innate. But if a trait is an adaptation, then that does show that it is innate. So all adaptations are innate, but maybe there are various innate traits that are not adaptations. So that would certainly be one way to deal with this problem. I suppose, though, one question here would be, well, what exactly are these other factors that would be necessary, that sort of together with adaptation would be necessary for innateness? And what we might find is that maybe the other factors that are involved in innateness actually capture all the cases which are covered by the adaptation account, in which case you might wonder if the adaptation account is really necessary. But a final concern, I guess, about the adaptation account is, in some ways, it perhaps just seems to be, I guess, misguided in a very basic sense. When we think about people talking about adaptation in relation to innateness, arguably what's really going on is that adaptation is the explanation for why a trait is innate. So it's not that adaptation just is innateness. Rather, the fact that a trait has been produced and maintained by selection is what explains why it's innate. Presumably there could be other factors that also explain innateness. A trait may be innate due to genetic drift or due to developmental constraint or whatever. If this is right, then the adaptation account rests on a very basic error. There is an important connection between adaptation and innateness, but we can't define innateness in terms of adaptation. So adaptation explains innateness. Those were some problems for the adaptation account. I think the sort of key motivation for the adaptation account is this appeal to isolation experiments and the poverty of the stimulus argument, and there does seem to be something right about that. So we might wonder if there are some other views that also kind of account for these experiments, and we will discuss another possibility in the next video. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching.